Hello everyone, we're back. Today our guest is Andrea Thompson. To say that she is a spoken word veteran would be an understatement. For the past 25 years, she has helped push the art form throughout Canada, has designed and paved the way for a new generation of spoken word artists. She created and designed the longest running spoken word course at a university. She is the author of 2 books, and her 2005 spoken word CD, One, was nominated for a Canadian Urban Music Award. Today we're going to be talking about how Black history is the forerunner of poetry as we know it today. But first, Andrea Thompson is going to perform one of her monumental pieces, Soul Speak, for us. Everyone, please welcome Andrea Thompson.
Thank you, Ivy. Thank you. Okay, so this is a brief history of Soul Speak. Seemingly innocent spirituals, to both master and overseer, they were merely words, simple lyrics, ingenuous hallelujah ballads. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. But these words were charms, incantations chanted in secret freedom code, surreptitious melodies sung by restless slaves. Chariot became train, became a rumbling underground, echoing over plantation field of cotton, tobacco, and cane. Gospels for safety, for shouts, never mind, battle cries would leave a brother dead cold in a heartbeat. Mothers with babies strapped to their bent ears, snap back, sung of the unrelenting sun of the Old South, and men with bodies worked hard and raw till they were little more than meat and bone, recounted these so-called silly spirituals to both each other and God. God, they asked for strength. Each other, they asked for directions, where to cross over that river and where to board that subterranean northbound train to freedom. Then came the blues, belting out anguish over injustice after emancipation failed to deliver the promised land. Instead sending clansmen who strung up to lifeless one brother after another, as law enforcers turned away and crosses burned till dawn. Dallas blues, Memphis blues. I ain't had nothing but bad news. Crazy blues. Unabashed, these words laid claim to the pain of generations. Love was sought, found, then gone, gone, gone. But we shall overcome. Our history will not be undone. And so the young entered at their peril, the guarded gates of academia, living the vision of Booker T. Washington, where scholarly success meant abandoning one's own language, meant adopting the mother tongue of Uncle Tom. Until a hunger for our own vernacular mingled with a passion of romanticism and a new language was born. On the page, on the stages of smoky coffee houses, deep in the heart of Harlem. In this Renaissance, we began to reclaim ourselves, began to own our newly found freedom to simply read and write out loud, to make love and meaning from our suffering, to live out loud, word by word, on our own terms. Langston Hughes left a language deep as the Euphrates that flowed into the ocean of Gwendolyn Brooks, bestowing permission for preachment as Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez reloaded the literary canon with unapologetic verse fueled by didacticism. And up here in the true north beyond that 49th parallel, Clifton Joseph and Lillian Allen waged a rub-a-dub revolution, and all across the country slam and hip-hop brought the acronym of rhythm and poetry back to the streets, and ghetto speak became fodder for heightened verbal artistry. These are our ancestors of verse. This is our lineage. and still unsung are so many who first spoke the words that birthed the language of soul speak.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We will be back in just 2 minutes. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So that was Andrea Thompson performing Soul Speak, one of her monumental poems. Today we will be talking about how Black history has really influenced spoken word as we know it today. And I just want to tell you a little bit more about Andrea Thompson before we get into it. Her CD 1 was nominated for the Canadian Urban Music Award in 2005. She has an upcoming CD, Soul Orations, that is launching in mid-April. You can order it on iTunes for purchase or streaming. Her book, Over Our Heads by Inanna Publications, is a prose book. It is gorgeously written. I'm currently on chapter 5. It is absolutely beautiful. We will talk about that more at the end. She also has a poetry book, Eating the Seed, which is currently out of print, but it will be coming back. And Other Tongues, she was the co-editor of the anthology Other Tongues, Mixed Race Women Speak Out. She is the forerunner of spoken word courses in Ontario, with the longest running spoken word course at OCAD University for 8 years. For the last 2 years, she has been running a spoken word course through the U of T Continuing School of Studies that is extremely popular. To let you know how important spoken word is in the current literature scene, both Harvard and Stanford implemented their spoken word courses in 2015. She did it in 2008. Andrea, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Ivy. Thank you.
That piece you just performed, Soul Speak, is so loaded. I mean, you take us through all of the building blocks from the beginning of time to now, with how the American slaves who came here and the heritage of Black history. Why is the piece so important to you? I mean, what inspired you to write it?
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me here. Ivy, I have so many things to talk to you about. I'm so excited. I just wanted to go back to one of the things that you mentioned. We were talking about the OCAD course, because I want to give the proper props.
Oh, yes.
And shout out to Lillian Allen, who is the one who put out the idea of the course beginning in the first place at OCAD, and who is a trailblazer and has done amazing things in the spoken word community.
Okay.
So I wanted to mention that. Okay, going back to Soul Speak. So Soul Speak was the inspiration. Somebody asked me to write a poem about the history of spoken word in Canada, and they said, can you do that? And I said, no, I cannot do that. The way that I think about spoken word, I think about it as this ocean.
Yes.
There's this ocean of spoken word, and there's all of these streams, all of these rivers of cultural influence that feed into this ocean. So I thought,
nothing is so cut and dry.
Exactly, and especially in a country like Canada, where we have all these multicultural influences, I thought, I can speak about one stream, one specific stream, and that would be the stream that I've studied, which is Black history, specifically Black literary history. And it's also something I'm passionate about because it's related to my own ancestral history, which is going back to southern Ontario about 500 years ago, and then before that, slavery. So we came up on the Underground Railroad. So this poem really traces Black history and traces the influence Black history has had on spoken word, starting in the days of slavery, moving up through the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s, into, through the 30s and 40s, into the Black arts movement in the 60s, and then up into what we know of contemporary spoken word today.
Absolutely, and you're going to take us through all of the points in the poem, which I think is really amazing. I mean, the piece in itself is, it's art. It's just, it reads like a book. And the one thing, it's just, one of the things you've said to me is, you've told me that some people say that Black history is the only influence on spoken word. But you think that's incorrect?
Oh, yeah. Well, definitely, because of the, the analogy of all these different streams, and especially when we're talking about a country like Canada that's so multicultural. And, every society, before they had literature, they had orature. So in Canada, it's like the First Nations people had a whole history of, of an oral tradition of storytelling. Mm-hmm. So, just within this one country, we have this tradition that's fed into what we call call now contemporary spoken word, that idea of telling your story. And so every single culture that's being represented in this country, which is pretty much all the cultures on the globe, has its own oral tradition, which to me has kind of fed into what we see happening in spoken word. But, you know, in terms of Black history, I think Black history, obviously I have a bias, as I said, with my own background, but I think there's a really significant contribution when you look at, you know, what we've inherited from Black history into spoken word. Like in slavery, there was this idea of the call and response.
And the spiritual gospels, and you said that they almost spoke. The call and response was when they were in the fields, singing to each other, so the slave masters didn't understand what was happening.
So this was an idea of, you know, having what scholar Lewis Henry Gates talked about in terms of signifiers, you know. So it's like using language and use in a way that's got dual meanings. So in one way, you can have a spiritual where you're singing like "Sweet Chariot," you know, is one of the most popular, where you're talking about, you know, a sweet chariot, which is, you know, maybe this you know, fictitious idea, but really you're talking about on another level the Underground Railroad. You know, you can have a spiritual where the slaves will be in the field talking about the promised land. On one level, you know, somebody can overhear that and think, oh, this is spiritual talking about heaven. On another level, these can be actual directions on how to access the Underground Railroad and how to find their way to Canada. So the promised land becomes this idea of an actual physical place where people can move and live and have an opportunity for freedom, which many people did.
And those codes of communication literally went over the heads of anyone listening from the outside.
Well, this is the idea. You have to have this way of communicating that's going to go underneath the radar. And this is one of the things that has been, you know, like a heartbreaker for the Black community, but also something that was used as a very clever survival mechanism, which is being underestimated. You know, so people would, you know, the overseers and the slave masters would listen and think, oh, these are silly spirituals. These are just, you know, childish, you know, very innocent songs. But really there's this whole other code happening to help people maneuver and find a way to create communities that could help them find their way to freedom.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Another, you know, back to the piece that you read, so to speak, like you talk about belting out anguish over injustice is one of the quotes. And that relates to the blues in 1930s, 1940s America. Right?
Well, a lot of people see, and
again, that was something they were kind of doing. They were belting out injustice in the fields, right? But then the blues movement, there's this whole, it's this beautiful lineage. It's a beautiful lineage with the literary arts and it's like kind of parallel equivalent with music. So, you know, what was happening is like, you know, you have the, you know, abolition of slavery and this idea of, and now we will be free and now everything will be wonderful. And having that reality translate to, well, okay, there's, you know, and this is always the way, there's like the legal change that happens and then how does that translate into everyday reality? How does that translate in society? And so what people were finding, what the Black community was finding, is that okay, there's you know, legal abolishment of slavery, but there's still segregation. You know, there's segregation in public places. There's, you know, different places to sit on the bus, different, you know, drinking fountains to use. There's, you know, the KKK is happening. Black people are being, you know, treated as inferior human beings and hunted like animals. So this is freedom. This was the reality, and I think that in a lot of ways, the blues was really a response to that. There was a real sense of anguish that, you know, this is the freedom that we fought for. This is the reality that, you know, this is the promised land of emancipation. It was a great, you know, huge disappointment. And interestingly enough, in regard to the conversation I had with another guest of mine, Tom Hamilton, but again, the blues was really the first time where, and even the arts, you know, where Black people found a way to actually make it into mainstream media and capitalize on their art form, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a breaking out from that, the under echelons. But then it also makes me think about something you said, which is true, the other day, is like when you're talking about, the segregation on the buses and you're bringing out in all these examples, even when, like, I'm jumping ahead here a bit for a moment, but even with the civil rights movement and all that, but when the laws are changed, it still takes a cultural society time to catch up. And so that anguish was coming out in the blues music.
Yeah. Oh, and we're still catching up.
Yeah.
We're not there yet, and there can be a certain kind of celebration of black culture that's happening today, but it doesn't mean that like, we have more polite racism, I think, now.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. It's a tolerant view, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's more polite, but it's still there.
Yeah.
And I want to come back to this song, I always call it a song, but it is spoken word piece. But I mean, you have a beautiful voice. You're a singer as well, and that is the cultural slavery still exists. And then again, I mean, you had the line in the piece, Dallas blues, crazy blues, and that's about how it does take society's time to adapt. And then there's this biblical line about ye shall overcome.
Yeah.
And it comes down to perseverance.
Yeah, and there's a real through line too with this. We talk about like this literary history and the parallel with the musical history, and woven through that is a lot of black spirituality. So that what became one of almost like an anthem of the civil rights movement was a song, "We Shall Overcome." That was related to a black spiritual that was written by a guy named, I think, Charles Albert in the 1900s, and it was the idea of one day I shall overcome. It was something like, in my season will come, I will overcome. And this is related to a biblical reference from Galatians, I think, saying that, in my season will come where I will overcome. So there's like this idea of perseverance. And there's been this tension, I think, in Black history with an idea of persevering and patience, and an understanding that that the changes that the Black community wants to see in society won't necessarily happen in our lifetime, but will be in the next generation. And so we'll have certain figures in Black history have been more patient. Say for instance in the 60s, they talk about the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King I would see him as being a figure who had more patience compared to somebody like Malcolm X, who was more like, okay, no, it's time for the revolution. Let's get this game underway.
Absolutely, and you've taught me a lot, and like that brings us because before Malcolm X, there was Booker T. Washington.
Yeah.
And, I didn't know about him. And so for our viewers, I mean, your information's incredible. But Booker T. Washington, was a scholar, a journalist, and he had this kind of integrationalist approach, if I understand correctly.
Yeah.
And he literally said to Black people, didn't he? He said, scholars that he told them, if you want to get into the universities, you need to talk like a white person. And scholarly success meant abandoning one's own language and adopting the mother tongue of Uncle Tom. And that was the beginning of minorities moving into universities. Is that true?
Yeah, so Booker T was a real advocate for getting young Black people into opening up those doors, which were completely sealed up until his activism to make this change happen. And it's I don't think that was the quote from my poem, but it's that idea that integrationalist approach, like let's not make a lot of waves, but do what we need to do in order to
get access.
Just get access, exactly.
And that was the beginning of the universities, essentially. Well, once minorities were getting into them, realizing the value in educating minorities. But it was also, what's interesting with that is a lot of people are familiar with the English literature modernist movement, which was around the 1920s in the modernist era, the eras, if you look at America versus Britain, it changes, but it was around the 1920s. But the Black people were also doing something different at that time, whereas you had the white modernists who were against traditionalism. They wanted to break it down, and they were the privileged, modernists such as Ezra Pound, James Joyce, and others. Whereas at this time, was it around this time that the Black modernist movement was rising, and they were creating their own arts movement that was kind of traditionalistic in a different way?
Well, not exact, kind of. So, okay, white modernism was the idea of let's make it new, let's overthrow the old vanguard, whereas black modernism, which is kind of like coming into play in the 20s, around the same time as the Harlem Renaissance, is the idea is let's celebrate the fact that we do have a literary history. You know, so there was this reaching back, and this
into the roots.
Yeah, and this is the beginning too. We talk about these different influences that have fed into spoken word today. One of the things that was happening at that point in time that was really exciting was the idea of, and it's kind of like everything is reacting against each other. So, Booker T. Washington was like this idea of let's be integrationalists. The Harlem Renaissance was like, no, let's now reclaim our own vernacular. Let's talk to our community, use our literary arts as a way to talk to our community the way that we talk. So now we see this using like really straight up language, using idioms, using slang in poetry. Langston Hughes was...
he was a huge advocate, a civil rights movement leader, and he had a caricature which was... his most famous poem, A Negro Speaks of Rivers, and his caricature, Jessie B. Simple, really drew, it was published in May, he was a columnist, and this caricature really drew attention to racial inequities.
Yeah, so
in a way that had never been done before, right?
Yeah, so this was like the kind of Langston Hughes' claim to fame was this these short stories, a series of short stories that he wrote for a newspaper. I think it was maybe in Chicago, I can't remember, but it was a major city newspaper, and these was a series of short stories with this main character called Jessie B. Simple, and Jessie B. Simple was a black kind of everyday figure, but almost like a clownish kind of figure that was used as a caricature, to kind of turn these stereotypes on their head and show the absurdity through it with a kind of like parody approach.
That's interesting because it was being published in a mainstream newspaper.
Yeah.
So that means white people were actually laying eyes on this.
Yeah. And it really, I think it kind of was the beginning of a real change that typified the Harlem Renaissance, which is the idea of speaking to black people using language that black people are understanding, that are part of the culture. So instead of, okay, we're going to abandon our culture in order to put on this other way of being, this more white,
which
kind
Booker
of
T
mainstream.
said
Exactly.
First. Now
it's
they
like,
were
no,
coming more to their own, right?
Let's celebrate, and so then we have like this idea of these coffee houses in Harlem. You talked about jazz, and so there's now this flourishing of black creative arts that's happening on its own terms, right? So we have like poetry of Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, who's like talking about talking to black people of black people's experience in the language of black people, and we've got jazz music happening, in these in the same spaces, and this was a real, renaissance. It was a real kind of flourishing of creativity.
Absolutely, and that was the black modernist black arts movement, really, right?
Well, the black arts movement came in the 60s. And
so this was a little bit before.
This is in the 20s, right?
So we're still in the 20s.
Yeah, we're still in the 20s. So this is what I say in the poem, right?
Yeah.
So we've got Langston left this language deep as the Euphrates. So that refers to, A Negro Speaks of Rivers, which was his most kind of landmark poem. And then I say that flowed into the ocean of Gwendolyn. So Gwendolyn Brooks is kind of like one of the next generation's major literary figures. Gwendolyn Brooks was very much influenced by Langston Hughes, as well as Jill Scott Heron was very much influenced by Langston Hughes. Many people call Jill Scott Heron the granddaddy of rap. So you can see this lineage that's flowing through. So we got Gil Scott Heron, in the 60s, but also the Black Arts movement. So we've got the Civil Rights movement, which is happening, in the sort of social political culture, and then we've got in the literary culture the Black Arts movement. So we've got
which
Gil
is
Scott
like the creative
Heron,
equivalent.
Exactly. So we got Gil Scott Heron and Mary Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, and they're now using poetry as a vehicle for social justice. So again, you can see this happening in the slams. You know, you've got people standing up and talking about being disenfranchised at the local poetry slams and doing exactly this, using poetry as a vehicle for social justice. Well, this was a huge part of what was going on in the Black arts movement in the 60s. And again, it's like this revival, you know, this blossoming of Black creativity in urban centers.
Yeah, and you know, you actually had kind of a Sonia Sanchez moment, but we'll get to that in a minute. But I mean, with Amira Baraka and Sonia Sanchez, they started the Black studies in universities.
Well, what I studied,
They started the Asian studies, gender studies.
I don't know about Amiri Baraka. From what I understood, it was Sonia Sanchez.
Yes.
Who petitioned somewhere, I think it was in California University, maybe
And
Berkeley.
she was knocking on the doors.
Knocking on the door. There was no Black studies, there was no gender studies, there were no Asian studies, these kind of minority, studies.
Yeah, no feminist studies.
They didn't exist. So, this is my understanding, and hopefully this is correct, but she was the first to petition for a Black Studies course and Black Studies programs. And so once that was put into place, the next things that came along the line were gender studies and Asian studies and this kind of thing. And that influenced me, for instance, like when I went to U of T,
Yeah.
I had to go and knock on the door of the continuing studies department and say, and now how about we do a spoken word course? And they were like, what? And I'm like, yeah, this is a great idea. And they were like, okay, and took a chance on me. And I'm really grateful for that, because it was a risk. It wasn't part of the curriculum. It wasn't part of what was going on in continuing studies at all. But I wouldn't have had the gumption to do that if it wasn't for thinking like people like you know, Sonia Sanchez, who did those kind of cold calls.
Well,
and
what is
took
it?
the chance.
Absolutely. And what's incredible with that is, I mean, you'd already been doing the course at OCAD for 10 years prior to that. A spoken word course.
Yeah, okay.
And at the U of T one is immensely popular. You have mentored and some of the biggest spoken word people on the scene today, such as Michelle Hilliard and another lady.
Sabrina Benai.
Yeah, Sabrina Benai, who has over 80,000 YouTube hits on her
Is it
video.
that many? Yeah, she's
and My Depression to My Mother, I think it's
yeah,
called.
Explaining depression to my mother. Yeah.
And these have been some of your students.
Yeah, I've had some amazingly talented people that I've had a chance to mentor, and it's such a privilege, you know, like spoken word is such a transformational art form. I love to teach it because it changes people's lives. You know, you see people taking the essence of who they are, and it's from this fragile vulnerability of what it means to be human in a really raw, authentic way, and taking that and forming that into words and putting it out into the world. The courage that it takes to do that changes people's lives. So I have people who come in with this desire to do that, which takes a very unique individual as it is, and then just raw talent, and seeing
it's transformative.
And I get to work with them, and I get to kind of, you know, I think I'm a good teacher, and I think one of the things that helps me be a good teacher is to be able to just be a mirror. I feel like my students come to me and they're like, okay, this is what the problem is and this is the answer, and I'm going to feed them both to you and send them back to me. So I'm trying to listen for what they're telling me. You know, like this is what I'm trying to say. This is how I'm trying to say it. These are what my blocks are.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. You spot the blocks and you're able to overcome them, because everyone experiences writer or creativity blocks.
Yeah.
I wanted to. Now, you had an interesting experience when you were doing your MFA at Guelph University. It was kind of a big Booker T moment, because I think the way you explained it to me, you went and you assumed that the students, your fellow students, would embrace you, and that academia would tell you, no, you need to speak like a white person, or do this or do that, abandon your art. And in fact, the reverse happened, and you were kind of bullied, and tell us the story.
Well, okay, so there was, my assumption was, and it was incorrect. So my assumption was that I studied at the University of Guelph Creative Writing Department, which is a fantastic program. I just loved it. I had an amazing time. But I had kind of prepped myself. I thought, okay, so you're going to, you're coming out of this really grassrootsy spoken word, guerrilla poetry art form into, a post-secondary institution. You're going to be studying proper P poetry. So you might have to leave some of that, aesthetic at the door. Then when I got there, what I found was that the administration was hugely supportive of me, hugely supportive, as well as the professors. In fact, one of the most influential people in my writing career, and I would say the person who inspired much of what's going on in the poem that I shared earlier, is Lynn Crosby.
Yeah.
And so, I was like, okay, so get ready.
And she was one of your teachers?
Yeah, so she was one of my teachers, and she was like, no, keep doing what you're doing. Like, you're on the right path, keep doing what you're doing. And she was the one who introduced me to Sonia Sanchez. She's like, have you heard of her before? And I hadn't, which I now think is kind of like, what? How had I not? But I hadn't, I think, just so I would get to be introduced to her by Lynn Crosby. And Lynn was like, okay, she's, great sense of intuition. She was like, okay, I want you to go study Sonia Sanchez. I want you to write an essay and do a presentation on her. So I, went and did the research. And for me, it was like this hugely transformational experience, because before that I felt like I was just writing Andrea poetry from Andrea land and just kind of like bushwhacking out there in the wilderness all by myself. And, and knowing that I had made a decision that I wanted to use accessible language, knowing I had made a decision that musicality was, or not even made a decision, but, naturally musicality became a really important part of my aesthetic, but not realizing that this was not a wheel that I had invented, that this was a part of this huge lineage of creativity that, related to my own ancestral history, my own heritage. So, this is what got me really fascinated in what was happening in Black history and how this is fed into spoken word. And it was really a door that was opened to me by Lynn Crosby. So yeah.
Yeah, and I was fortunate enough to meet her the other day with you by chance.
Yeah,
which was so
funny?
fortuitous.
I know, it's funny.
And it was amazing, and she's still on the scene. But I want to say, just it's the bullying topic is important, and you felt kind of pushed out by your fellow students, and it was kind of cliquey, and it's this, instead the administration, Lynn Crosby in this case, came in and helped you say, no, you have what it takes.
Yeah, they were very supportive.
And helped you tap into your roots and inspire you and transform and create a transformative experience, which now you're kind of passing on to your students.
Yeah, well, I really think that there's this idea of this stream, this lineage, this stream with creative inspiration. I love that in that poem I get to talk about Lillian Allen, because she, also was opening, has opened doors for me, has opened doors for a lot of poets as well, in the scene. And Sherry D. Wilson as well was very influential for me. George Eliot Clark, these have been like the three kind of main people, I think, who have been very supportive. And I think that that's the thing, is that I was taught what mentorship means.
Yes.
Because of the support that I've gotten, and it's made me aware of, feel a kind of, they modeled, this is what you do. This is what you do for the next generation, and it's a very humbling thing, to be a mentor, because you have to you get to see these people blossom and hopefully surpass you. And most of my students, a lot of them, do surpass me, I think, in terms of their talent and their capabilities. And it's just amazing, to have the opportunity to watch people blossom, but at the same time, it's this step back that you take as an artist as well.
Well, yeah, I think it was Aristotle who said, essentially, once the pupil surpasses the teacher has succeeded.
Yeah.
And it seems to me you're doing that. You've connected your own political narrative to your roots, to your art. You're helping other people do that. And as we kind of move towards the end of the interview here, but you created I mean, on the spoken word scene, I mean, you paved the way for the country's. Tell me something about what you've done in the 25 years on the spoken word scene.
Oh my gosh.
Because where do you see it going, especially with, the minorities finally having proper access to universities, with the diversity in Canada, and spoken word is on the rise, poetry's on the rise.
Well, yeah. So I think, like moving into the future, there's, it's like this. When I started in spoken word in the mid-90s, there was, this was when the internet began.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this real explosion in technology, and that had a huge impact on how we kind of cross-pollinated as spoken word artists. So when I first started, one of the things I was doing, I was hosting a radio show, and I had to go to the events and kind of bounce around from event to event in Vancouver, and then come back and report it to the radio show, and we would go on air and talk about it. When I was on the Slam team back in 1994, I think it was, and we went down to Portland. We were the first kind of voted on a team to come out of Canada, and so we went down to Portland and saw this kind of poetry that we'd never seen before, and it just blew our mind. And we had to come back and kind of try
Was
to
it Slam?
translate. Yeah, so Slam didn't exist in
Wow.
Canada in the mid-90s. So now to see what's happened in the scene, it's like in the time that I've been doing spoken word, it went from, we didn't know what it was like, what is Slam, what does that mean? We didn't even know what it was. It wasn't a thing. The word spoken word didn't exist.
Yeah.
We called ourselves performance poets or fusion poets.
I
There was all
remember
these
that term.
different terms being thrown around. So to see the change that's happened in that time, now there's a slam in every city in the country. There's youth slams. There's like several slams in every city. There's like, it's just this huge growth. I don't think that there's any art form that has expanded so much so quickly. But one of the things that was happening.
And it's always Slam is often political.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
what I like about it.
Yeah, well, there's like this. It's democratic.
Mm-hmm.
There's no gatekeepers saying somebody has to decide that you have a right to your voice. It's just you showed up, you got on the mic, and now you have a platform, and that's the thing that's really revolutionary about it. The person who invented slam, Mark Kelly Smith, that was the idea behind it, was to make it democratic and to remove that idea of gatekeepers from poetry.
Yeah.
So that was like a big part of it, also because it's youth culture, so you're often having people who have felt, disenfranchised and separated and disempowered and separated from the mainstream culture, and now have an opportunity to speak about their own reality.
And people are listening.
Yeah. But now, so what's different is, like, before there was no connection because there wasn't the internet. So, there was a different kind of aesthetic that was coming out, say, in Montreal, right, where people were, doing a lot of things that were like theater-based and music-based, especially. Vancouver was really good for like a theatrical kind of scene. And Toronto had its own scene happening with like people like Black Cat, and Jill Batson was doing a lot of exciting things back in those days. So every scene kind of had its own, but very separate. And now there's all this cross-pollination. So when I think about what can happen in the future, I really think that technology is going to have a huge amount to do with it. I've just been working on a project with a publisher, Brick Books.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was working on with them was curating an online library of spoken word artists, and
Very good.
using the technology to highlight a different type of literary artists than that Brick had been able to support previously. So really opening it up in terms of the genre, in terms of what kind of artists are
And
still at the level of excellence, though.
Yeah, Break Books is actually doing a lot right now. I know they did their first podcast. They compiled it I think it's out now. They were compiling it back a few months ago in the fall. of
The Brickyard, that's
Yeah,
what it's called.
that's
Yeah, that
it.
was my idea. I
Yeah.
came up with that
Awesome.
name.
I know some poets on there.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
it's done really well. They're really excited. It seems like they're going to do it again as an annual thing with more poets next year. I think there's 6 in this one.
It's an ongoing
Yeah.
platform. It's an ongoing platform, and so people will be able to submit their,
Their works.
Yeah, yeah. So
But-
it's print and now multimedia
Yeah,
as
and
well. So I think
audio.
that's going to be the future, really, is moving towards, online publishing. And it was something that had to be worked through. Like, what does this mean now? One of the things that I advocated for when I was working with Brick is because of what I was hearing from the community, is we have to make sure that there's a way to have profit sharing for this. This is a revenue stream. Well, what does that mean? What does it look like? So these are things that have to be sorted out. And it takes time. There's like an evolutionary process that's happening. So we've got this technology. Now it's like, okay, well, how do we use this?
So
and
even
what does it
he-
look like in the
And
future?
even here, you're tapping into the fact that there needs to be a, economical aspect to sharing this knowledge.
Yeah. Well, there always is. There always is. And I think like this is the thing, is that when you're looking at new ways of going, new technologies, new ways of going about it, you're always going to find, okay, so what's the next, I've got an idea. Well, what does it look like now? How does that translate? And sometimes these are things that you discover as you move forward with a plan, is, oh yeah, well, we have to incorporate this aspect of it, or that aspect of it. Yeah.
Well, just listening to you talk, it's unbelievable. You're still advocating for spoken word. You're still at U of T continuing studies. You're pitching new courses to new schools. And it is beyond obvious that spoken word needs to be part of English curriculum at our top schools.
Well, it will be.
It will be. But
It's
it
a
needs
matter
to-
of time. I
yeah.
just hope that I get to, be part of it.
Well, of course. You're doing so much on the scene. You even work with people at CAMH and helping them
Yeah,
write
I
spoken
love
word.
it. Yeah, I love it.
And-
Can I give a shout out? So that's
Oh,
a Workman
yeah.
Arts. It's an organization that's funded through CAMH, but it is just such a wonderful place. It's a real labor of love. They pay me as well, but it's a labor of love because it's so rewarding for me. This is a space where they have visual artists, literary artists, filmmakers, and it's basically anybody who has for people who have like mental health or addiction histories or issues, who are artists. So this isn't art therapy. These are practicing artists to have a space to go and continue their work as artists while concurrently dealing with these issues. So it's a beautiful, wonderful space. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let's tell the viewers. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Ivy. Thank
And
you.
your CD, your new CD is coming out, Solorations.
Yes.
And it's going to be available on iTunes. Pre-orders are available now.
Yes.
Through your website in about the next week.
Yes.
AndreaThompson.ca.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out because the CD couldn't be possible without. Oh yeah, there I am.
Yeah.
Without Everin Oz did the music
Mm-hmm.
for it. I also collaborated with him on my CD 1,
Yes.
which was nominated for the Urban Music Award. He's an amazing, amazing musician. On this CD, Solorations, we have his wife, Courtney Brooks Buxton, who's doing background vocals, who just sings like an angel. I get goosebumps listening to her.
wow.
And Angela Macaroni, who does a flute solo on this CD as well. So
Lovely.
Yeah.
And for our viewers, just know Andrea Thompson is the only one on iTunes. So you just got to put her name in and she'll come up. And Solorations is one word. And you can pre-order individual songs or the CD or the full thing on iTunes. And check out Andrea Thompson's website. And also, Over Our Heads is published by Inanna Publications, which I'd like to say is a feminist press and one of the biggest presses in Toronto. Gorgeously written prose book, and this is about strangers who live in the same. It's very relevant to our times. I've started reading it, but it's strangers people in a family who should know each other, but they don't.
it's the idea of worlds collide, right? And it's taking. I wanted to think about this idea of we have people who are supposed to be the closest to us, but sometimes we don't really know who they are at all because there's no such thing as objectivity. Everything is subjective. So how does that relate to people who we are in relationship with? Like we're looking at each other through our lens. So I thought I wanted to explore explore that, and I thought it would be really fun to take like just completely like polar opposite characters and bring them together. So we've got Rachel, who's an actuary who's interested in cosmology, and Emma, who's a pet psychic and interested in poetry, and bring them, and ESP and telepathy and astrology, and bring these two together and kind of see how they deal with each other in an environment of grief. So it's kind of this idea of like mysticism versus pragmatism, and worlds collide, and which is kind of a microcosm for this soup of humanity that we live in.
And absolutely, and when you strip away the layers, it really illustrates we're all one. We're all the same underneath.
Yeah.
And what I loved about it is it takes place in Toronto.
Yeah.
And the narrative is gorgeous. Over our heads, everybody. Inanna Publications. You can order it through Inanna or on Amazon.
Can I tell you something fun? Oh wait, no, I can't. It'll be a spoiler. But there's something in the book. You'll see it when you finish it. I won't tell you. But there was something that happened in the news that had to do with a capybara, which was a very interesting tie-in to how the novel ends. I think I'll leave it at that, or else I'll totally spoil it for you.
The people have to buy the book in order to find out.
Yeah, life imitated art.
That's often how it is. And art imitates life. I think the two go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And I should mention your other book as well is through Inanna, the one you co-edited.
With Debbie Durango Adam,
Yes.
who's a brilliant poet. Yeah, it's called Other Tongues, Mixed Race Women Speak Out, and it's an anthology of writing by mixed race women, everything, writing and art as well. So there's poetry, there's essays, all exploring the experience of being mixed race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd like to tell our viewers you can find Andrea. She's got a few features upcoming, obviously, and she's got her new CD coming out. So March 10th, she will be at the Drake Hotel, the Toronto Poetry Slam, which I'm sure you will blow them away. So March 10th at the Drake Toronto Poetry Slam. April 2nd, she'll be at the Poetry Jazz Cafe for Wild Writers, which is Georgia Wilder's writing series. It's wildly fantastic. And April 30th, she will be on Howl Radio with, of course, Valentino Essenza, and her CD will be out by then. If you forget these dates, it's okay. Check out her website. Also visit theartistmagazine.com. We have an events page, updated daily. All the events are there. And you can always reach out to me if you need to get in touch with Andrea. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you next month in March 2019. Thank you for viewing. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ivy. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.